Welcome to For Good Measure, an interview series celebrating diverse composers and other creative artists, sponsored by a grant from the California Arts Council. I'm Nanette McGuinness, Artistic Executive Director of Ensemble for these times. In this week's episode, we continue our conversation with Rajna Swaminathan, who we spoke to in January 2024. How has your identity and how has your background played a role in your path? We've heard it, how it's influenced your compositions to some extent, but let's see if you can kind of focus on this one for a little bit for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I was really curious about, what it means to be an Indian American and to kind of zoom out a bit, just a South Asian American, and what other kinds of music have been created in the diaspora. I've just tried to open myself up to more recently, because I think when you're in Indian classical music, there's a lot of elitism that's built into that music, as I'm sure there is in all forms of music that
Yeah.
call themselves classical. Um,
Oh, right.
Finding and in India it's quite nefarious because it's connected to caste,
Yeah.
and um I've wanted for a long time to figure out what are those things that I can't even sense within myself that are actually about caste, that, you know,
Mm.
um, in the ways that it manifests in aesthetics.
Yeah.
And one way that I've uh, learned to do that, I would say from my my best friend and closest collaborator, Ganavia, who's a vocalist and composer and scholar, and who was actually the second student at Harvard, right right after me.
Right.
Um, because she has been, she, like me, came from the Carnatic music scene and is similarly like a musical family. But she also has this background in this devotional style of music called the Varakari Sampradaya. And, it might be, I don't really believe in all these designations, but you might call it a folk music or a kind of sacred music.
Mm.
Uh,
Okay.
and it just has such a different vocal style. And when I met her now, I guess 8 years ago, I just remember being so drawn into that as a possibility. And when we started working together, it really forced me to contend with, okay, my music is not really about combining Indian classical music with jazz or something. It's really about understanding this broader identity that has so many kinds of musical practices embedded within it. Um, and it also extends to the fact that I grew up listening to Bollywood music, and, you know, my parents would almost always talk about like the Indian classical influences on Bollywood music. But as I thought about it as an adult, I was like, well, there's actually so much in there. There's elements of jazz, there's elements of classical music, Western classical music, there's elements of different South Asian folk music traditions. There is Indian classical music elements
Mhm.
in it.
Mhm.
But the beautiful thing about that music is that it combines all of them and integrates all of them. So working with Ganavia really created this new set of conversations, which made the music less about like trying to, bring these abstract concepts together and more about understanding this like broader South Asian sensibility, which permeates all different kinds of music
Mhm.
from that part of the world. And I've been trying to think a little bit more about it recently, because I find myself in community with people who are who are not from an Indian classical music background, but who, for instance, DJ Rekha, who's whose background is not only as a DJ but in Bhangra,
Mm.
and that as a community binding force. Um, and I think there's so many artists. Like that in the South Asian scene that, and it's hard to point to all of them right now, but that I think I find myself needing to interface with and think about as being in community with the music that I make. Um, so in terms of that, I think I've really needed to step outside of my like Indian classical training and think more about these broader historical encounters that even Indian classical music was shaped by. It was only labeled to classical music in the early 20th century when
Mm.
like needed a place in the kind of political landscape. Um, but before that, it was, combinations of different communities coming together and different kind of community aesthetics coming together. So I find myself wanting to return to that as I think in these diasporic terms.
Mm.
And the other thing is, being a queer artist, thinking through my identity. Uh, Not that queerness needs to have its own aesthetic, but living a queer life brings a kind of open perspective onto the forms that we inherit. I think it explains a lot about even my engagement with Carnatic music because I was always kind of curious about these rhythmically ambiguous things. I was not always moved by incredibly mathematically
Precise.
oriented and precise music. I was
Yeah.
almost always curious about the in-betweens.
Yeah.
And it makes sense in retrospect. I'm like, okay, well that makes sense. I had a very kind of queer approach to rhythm, and continue to have that curiosity. And I write about it in my dissertation in terms of queer temporality,
Mm.
and thinking about not only multiplicity in terms of perspective, which is a very intercultural kind of thing, but really noticing that things are always in flux and things are always dynamic, um,
Mm.
and learning how to listen for that movement and not always being in a position of just trying to categorize or lay things down in a firm way, but really allowing things to be fluid. And connecting that with my queerness, I think was something that I was able to do in the process of working on my PhD because there's so many queer scholars who've written about this. I just found myself really resonating with that and thinking, okay, well, there's clear applications of this to music, and specifically to my own personal journey with music. Whether it's being between genres and traditions or literally just having a curiosity about the in-betweens musically. Um, I think that for me, it sort of feels very integrated to think about it from the perspective of being a queer artist and wanting to
Hmm.
question those lines and boundaries.
Right. In terms of fluidity and the temporality and all that, that makes sense actually. And it even fits how this interview has flown because at each point you're usually slightly right where I'm about to go with you anyway, which is wonderful. It's been an interesting collaborative process. I mean, I still have a few more questions for you, but it's been a very interesting flow for doing this interview and very enjoyable as far as it goes on my end. So it's
Yeah,
been interesting.
likewise.
What advice would you give to composers who are seeking to incorporate themes and concepts of identity and culture into their works?
Sure. I think my one piece of advice, which is something I've learned over time, is to not force it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think the more that you try to force something to happen, the less likely it is to happen in a meaningful way. Um, and I think there's ways that, I mean, I've learned from my collaborators that just living your life and paying attention to things just in your lived experience, uh, and noticing how they manifest in your creative work can be a way of orienting it towards that. It doesn't have to be like a one-to-one relationship where you can clearly, explain what is what in a piece. And I find myself in this situation always because um, people do want me to explain my work or justify it or say why, and I'm not saying that your questions are doing this. In fact, I think if anything, your questions are allowing me to you know, say exactly why I don't think that needs to happen. Um, because we're always in flux, and what I say to you today is going to be different if we speak like a year or two from now.
Absolutely.
So I don't see the purpose of fixing it. I don't see any purpose in saying, well, this is the Indian part of my work, and this is the Western part of my work. Because even those categories are in flux, and have informed each other over the years, over the centuries, I should say. Um, and so I think my advice in general, maybe this is obviously probably pertinent for young female and queer composers, but to any composer, I'd say who's trying to deal with their identity, is to allow it to come forward in ways that maybe you don't understand yet, and maybe you'll listen back a couple of years from now and it'll make sense in a different way. And to allow that depth to come through. There's this Martinican poet philosopher whose work I really enjoy, Edouard Glissant, and he talks about it as the right to opacity, because there are all these colonial frameworks that make us feel like we need to be intelligible to the, what is usually defined as a kind of white gaze, or like a white framework.
Right.
And or a kind of framework that wants to taxonomize. And his whole point is, well, actually, maybe lean into your right to not be intelligible. Lean into your right to be mysterious, and to maybe not even have those things clearly defined for yourself. Because sometimes the most meaningful and deep kinds of experiences come from not knowing.
The mystery. Yeah.
Known, right. And so that's sort of my general advice in saying don't force it, is to also allow things that you don't know to come through.
That's true. When one forces things, they never work. They really don't. But what you were saying about the mysterious, or the unnamed, or the non-categorized, my mom is an artist, and for years she wouldn't put titles on her pieces. She refused, because she said it would, and she's right, that it would focus the viewers' expectations on the piece, and they would see it in a certain way, and she didn't want that. So it was interesting. Yeah. So the unfathomable becomes, or stays that way, instead of just, you put a stamp on something and say, okay, this is about that, so we'll move on now. So
it closes the conversation a bit.
Yeah, I think so. Or at least it constricts it, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to For Good Measure, and a special thank you to our guest, Rajna Swaminathan, for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast by clicking on the subscribe button, and support us by sharing it with your friends, posting about it on social media, and leaving us a rating and a review. To learn more about E4TT, our concert season online and in the Bay Area, or to make a tax-deductible donation, please visit us at e4tt.org. This podcast is made possible in part by a grant from the California Arts Council and generous donors like you. For Good Measure is produced by Nanette McGuinness and Ensemble for These Times, and designed by Brennan Stokes, with special thanks to co-producer and audio engineer Stephanie M. Neumann. Remember to keep supporting equity in the arts, and tune in next week for Good Measure.